Here we go. Hey, everybody, it's Sarah Donovan. Welcome to Author Talk, where we are meeting the authors who contributed so generously to the Just YA anthology that is in paperback, but is also open access on Oklahoma State University's open education resource. And the link will be in the description below. So today we are here with Sandy Marchetti, who contributed two short, fantastic poems to the anthology. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. It's wonderful to be with you today.
Will you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you are in the world?
Yeah, so I live outside of Chicago, Illinois, and this is the place that I've called home for most of my life, not all of it, but definitely for me, this is the landscape here contributed heavily to the poems that I um, produced for the anthology. I write a lot about Midwestern landscapes. I also write a lot about sports, which, I contributed to another anthology about sports writing with Sarah, and I have a book of sports poems. But the Midwestern landscape is something that I care about. And when I saw the Just Land feature in Just YA, I thought, these poems would be perfect for it. Um, how did I become a writer? I think for me, I always loved stories as a kid. I wrote some little stories. I love to draw. I love to, kind of play with imaginary friends. I was an only child. I wasn't, I enjoyed sort of, I enjoyed playing dolls. I think for me, I was in college and I was a history major in college, and I had a internship at an archive, and I didn't really enjoy being at the archive. I remember thinking, this is boring. It's very dusty here. My allergies are acting up. And I thought about, why am I a history major if I don't like working in a place like this? And it's like, I actually really enjoyed the stories. I loved someone telling me stories about the past. I loved like kind of getting involved with those characters. And with poetry, I'm a metaphor maker. That's sort of where my creativity lies. It's less about building a world. It's more about thinking what are things that are like other things and kind of making those connections and patterns. I think of poems kind of like puzzles. And really what we do when we write poems, or at least for me, is it's an experience of playing, of deep play, of flow in the brain. And for me, I really enjoy that feeling. That's the feeling that makes me feel most alive. And poems are puzzles we can almost never totally solve. So I think that's what keeps me coming back to them and keeps me engaged in my writing now. So
Love it. Thank you so much for that. Um, I just a side note, a little off topic. What town or what city in Illinois are you in?
yeah, I am in Lisle, which is a suburb to the west, and it's just a little town outside of, like, people may know the Naperville or Aurora area, and it's near there.
Hmm. I grew up in Villa Park.
Ah, okay, very good.
Yes, and so I know that area very well and the landscape of it. How did we connect originally? Do you remember?
I don't. I think I saw a call for rhyme and rhythm somewhere. I don't know who, for a while I was writing, I have a prop. I was writing this book, Aisle 228, which is a book of poems about the Chicago Cubs, going to games with my father and listening to baseball on the radio. And for years, people knew I was writing this book, and they so generously sent me calls for submission for anything sports related. I would just get messages. So I think someone sent me a call for submission, and I was like, oh, yes, of course I want to be involved in this. So I think that's how it started.
This book, can you hold it up again?
Yes.
How do you think that would be for like high school students?
I think it would be great. Actually, I had a friend who works at a community college in Oregon, and she had the baseball team reading this book. And I believe they were freshmen in college. And really the book meets people at different levels. Like, I have had a lot of people read Aisle 228 who have not read a book of poetry ever in their life, but they know baseball, they know the game of baseball, and so they feel like they completely understand the book. And then I know friends who are poets or poetry readers who have said to me, I know nothing about baseball. I've watched one game in the last 20 years, but I felt like the book really was amazing and made me interested in the game because they maybe understood it from the poetry perspective. So I think you can get into it in a lot of different ways. And I
Yeah,
think that it's appropriate for anybody who's probably, I would say, over 14, you know? Yeah.
excellent. Well, also know a ton of Cub fans, and I have a lot of family members who have a tradition of going to Cubs games with their families and just have a special place in their heart. So I am going to find that book and share it, read it and share it. So I can't wait.
Aw, so kind. Thank
Well,
you.
how about you share some of your poems from Just YA? What should we begin
Yes. I think let's just go in order. We can read Chase first,
with? Okay.
which is really a short little poem in a like very fractured, it's not in a Japanese style, but it's sort of after a little bit after some of those styles that we know of, like, a haiku or a ringu or a tanka. Um, Chase. As the lightning jagged across the sky, she grabbed a bolt and stuffed it down her throat. And
I
kind of the thought, go ahead, please.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I kind of the thought process here was just about power. I think that there's different ways to sort of interpret this tiny little piece, but for me, it was just about sort of gumption and power and courage. So that's sort of what I was thinking here.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember first reading this poem when you submitted it with a colleague who was working on the editing with me, and we were just like gulped after reading the poem. And I think, well, yes, like on a number of levels, um, it was, jarring a little bit, like the lightning jagged across the sky. And she, this like pronoun is so important that it's like a particular person, but it's also inclusive of all she or anyone identifies as she, grabbed it. And I felt like this grabbing of the bolt, metaphorically, physically, and having the agency to stuff it down her throat and whatever, like and that felt very visceral and it felt kind of violent a little bit to me. Um,
Yes.
but also I kept thinking about the electricity and how like stuffing it down the throat, like the electricity could stimulate and as well, so we found like was really short poem and we talked about this for a long time as women, as women just growing up in like different settings. Um, but I just felt like this has layers of conversation and also just like sitting with it as a woman. And then I think even if we have students in our classroom talk about this, like what might that mean for a male reader to like think about the speaker of this poem or not the speaker, whoever the the subject is in it, right? So there's like it's from a third person, it's not an I, it's a she. And so all of those things are really just lead to a great conversation. But so this was when we read it, we were like, okay, this is going to be great. But we're like, oh, where do we put this in the book? And there's so many, there's different, like there's love and land and world and futures and being. And for some reason, we thought this was about self-love. But we felt like it could go in a lot of different places, so I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think for me, like every time I talk about the landscape, every time I write about the Midwest, I really think of it through a lens of, and maybe I think this is colored by people like Annie Dillard, where there's always the beauty, but then there's the danger of the natural world and the wilderness. And even in these, places that seem very tame, like a park or, you're walking around in a suburban area, like there's still the drama of life and death and the food cycle and all these things happening like in any place where there's natural life. So for me, like feel as though like my characters or my speakers, any of these people, they sort of get incorporated in that world where there's always that little bit of danger. But we are also told as human beings, right? Like we need to take risks, and especially for women, like I think like you said, reclaiming power or just like finding the power that was always within us. Like I think it's just, a lot of even now in 2024, I feel like women are still worried that they will be perceived a certain way if we're not quiet or taking up less space. So, I'm always advocating against that. So I guess this poem does do that as well, for sure.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Lots of layers and that beautiful. All right. Should we read
yeah.
the next one?
Yeah, let's read the next one. This one's a little more narrative-y. There's a little more of a story here. And this is actually written about an experience that I'll just be, completely honest about it. I'm the speaker here. This is an experience that happened to me down at the Naperville Riverwalk. So, if anybody knows where that is. Witness, a fat snake swiveled down a branch into the river, and I wondered, what if I had missed that? I said to a girl, they're usually not that big. Sure, she had seen it flop, but she said, thank God I did not. I would have screamed bloody murder. I walked on, smiling, tracing the thing's path, its inevitable disappearance.
As you read this a second time or read this again in this way, what stands out to you?
Well, you know what stood out to me, which I hadn't thought about this in a little while, but at the end, the snake is called the thing, which to me is interesting because, this is a snake, it's a living being. Again, we're talking about this in the context of just land and just YA. And I feel like it's really objectified at the end, especially because this other person is like, I hate snakes. But I think there's a little bit, again, of that danger, that riskiness about the wilderness and things like that, that even the speaker, in this case, I've outed myself, is fascinated by these snakes, but I wouldn't want one of these snakes in my house. I wouldn't, I still don't want, I want to watch them, but I don't want to get too close. So I think this idea of not quite being sure if we can accept the living being aspect versus they're a thing that they just need to get away from me aspect.
Mm.
So
Can you say something about the title? This, I think, is a thinking about titles and the way that we title poems or a way that we invite students to do that as something in addition to the text, right? Or as really part of the text. When we read traditional poetry or poetry that maybe didn't have a title, especially like in classical, literature courses, we just
yes.
first line is the title, right?
Hmm.
But here you have a word that's not anywhere else, witness.
Yeah, well, two things come to mind for me. Um, First of all, I think back to Annie Dillard, she has a chapter in Pilgrim at Tinker Creek called Seeing, which was very foundational to my work. And basically there's parts of that chapter where she talks about how if I didn't look at this and catalog this with my eyes, no one else would have ever seen it, right? And I think that's the idea of the witnessing of the snake. My husband says when we do go on walks down here, after it rains, the snakes come out. And he's like, you're the snake spotter. No one else can see the snakes. And I'm like, that's not true. This is what you look for, whatever. Um, but I think this idea of paying attention closely is the job of a writer. It's definitely the job of a poet. For me, it's just so important to be looking and kind of noticing the things that maybe other people aren't. Um, and like this other person in the poem didn't see it, and we're kind of glad that they didn't see it. But the job of the poet is to look at everything, even when other people want to look away, even when they're not noticing. And then I think also of someone like Carolyn Forche, who writes poetry of witness, and she calls it that. She has an anthology of poetry of witness. This is nothing like many of her poems, which are about extremely serious subjects, such as war, etc. But I do think that there's this idea of, not looking away, and being whatever your subject is, really learning it, even if it repulses you in a certain way. So,
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, I think as you're sharing the insight, and I hope that teachers are listening to this because I feel like this would even just be a fabulous writing prompt or a narrative, a mini narrative unit for students to do. Teachers are always doing this narrative unit, and it's always this personal story. And as a
yes.
college professor, I know that the students have written the same essay for 5 years. And they just keep rewriting it and keep giving it to the same, a different teacher who doesn't know. And they're not thinking about what narrative does or the other forms that narrative can take. And I think inviting students over a couple days to write a narrative of witness,
Yeah.
using your text as a mentor text and spending a little bit of time in their spaces, in their lived spaces to witness
Hmm.
something and write a short quick poem about that. And I think
Hmm.
also that you include some dialogue and noticing that someone else is not, someone else is turning away and you are gazing, to I'm also familiar with Portia's work, and I think like this is a perfect accessible form of this, for students to think about how important it is, what they notice and what they see and what they observe, and creating space in the classroom for that.
I think that's a great idea for teachers. And for me, I remember in college, I wrote a lot of museum papers in my art history courses where we went to the museum and you just write about um, a piece of art. You choose a piece of art. You don't necessarily have to include context, but just what you're seeing, what you're thinking, what you're feeling. Maybe talk a little bit about the environment. And I always thought for me later on as a creative writer, that was really useful, just being immersed in the environment, and immersed in that one canvas or that one, piece of art, whatever it may be. But that's something we can take outside and that's something we can take to other, environments too. So.
Yeah, love it. Well, we are closing our time here, so I'd like to end with just hearing what sort of projects you're working on or what sort of things we can look forward to next in
Yeah.
following your writing life.
So, the two poems I read today that are in the anthology, they're also coming out in a new book called Diorama, which looks at all these themes we've been talking about today in a little more detail. It also kind of explores influences. So, my writing influences and bringing them right into the work, crediting them, kind of bringing them to the forefront in ways. I think I dedicated the book to all the poets I've stole from. I mean, but I'm sort of telling them I'm stealing from them. I think that it's important to kind of look at influences and see kind of, what we're taking from them. Even what we talked about today, Dillard, Portia, they're in Diorama. And it's from the same publisher as IL 228, Stephen F. Austin, State University Text, State University Press, distributed through Texas A&M. Anybody can find them on Amazon or whatever. So in April, that diorama will be out. I'm also excited to go next March on a residency in Mineral, Washington at the Mineral School. It's at the foot of Mount Rainier. I'm really excited to go for 2 weeks and just sort of experience that landscape and try to write some poems and get another book into shape. Although I'm really thinking I want to break from book tours and publicity for a little while soon. So, so that's what's going on with me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you'd like to say to teachers or the high school students as we close?
Yeah, I do. I have a message. So so I taught poetry like at the college level too. I think what happens sort of with students is that they come in at that level at 18 or 19 years old and they're scared of being wrong about interpretation of the poem. And I'm sure you've heard this from other poets you've even interviewed on the series, but um bringing it back to the museum paper, like I talked about, like I almost feel like the verbal encouragement of a teacher or the written encouragement on the assignment sheet of telling the student please, please, please just write what you think, write what you feel. The way I did that with students to try to loosen them up was I would say, I'm going to read this poem out loud. Close your eyes. Some of them didn't like that. But then I want us to go through the five senses and see if you can pull out a detail from the poem of each of the five senses. Because it freed them up. Like I had a professor who called readers meaning making animals. And I think we're all that. We want to make the meaning, but like if you can somehow let yourself have the experience of the poem, even just delay that meaning making just a little bit, you will understand it better. Because no poet, including me, or well, I wouldn't say no poet, most poets do not have some idea of a meaning in mind that they're like, you have to get this. With my poems, what I said today, you might have gotten something completely different out of them, and I'm fine with that. So let your students have that courtesy too.
Love it. Thank you so much for being with us, Sandy.
Of course. Okay, bye.